If you don't know me, my name is Robert, and I'm one of the pastors here on staff. And I, like John, am also from Cleveland, and I, like John, escaped from Cleveland, and we praise the Lord for that, even though they are the rightful heirs to the Super Bowl. But that's okay, neither here nor there. So some of you know a little bit about me, but I wanted to start off with kind of an intense story about my childhood. And I'm going to talk about it in a way that's a little lighthearted, and I want you to know it's because I've worked through this for many years, and Jesus really has done a lot of healing in my heart with this issue. So I grew up in Cleveland. You know, all my brothers still live up there, and we all have different dads from one another, which makes family dynamics just so interesting when you have all these personalities clashing together. But the dads of my brothers were not all great men. So when I was 4, 5, somewhere around this, I have these distinct memories of trying to sleep. And one of my brother's dads would come into the room, and he would take me out of my bed, and he would just hold me next to him on the couch. And it would be like 1 in the morning or something, I don't even remember. Some memories I have, he's like holding a knife, and then other memories, I'm like, maybe I'm making that up. I'm not even sure, I can't remember. But he never did anything. He would just hold me, and he would say, don't breathe, don't talk, just be quiet, or I'll keep doing this. And that's like all I remember. And I remember he would say, I'm going to tell if you tell your mom about this, I'm going to keep doing this. And I've racked my brain as an adult, like, what was even the point of that? Like, I don't understand what he got out of that. But I share that with you because I imagine that resonates with some of your stories in here where you have been victims of injustice through no fault of your own. That was an example in my life where something bad happened to me there was nothing I did wrong to deserve that. And of course, you know, other times in your life, there are times when you do something wrong and you reap the consequences and you have to live with that. And still yet, there are times when you do the exact right thing, everything right, and yet you still end up facing totally unexpected results, or something blows up in your face and you're left thinking, what in the world is going on here? One example in my life is I came to faith about 17 years old, and it was after a breakup, and I was so in love. We'd been together for 4 months. We were going to get married. It was serious, and of course, you know, my heart was crushed, and I was hanging out with a friend group at that point that was drinking more and more, and it was like, oh, this is a nice, easy way to escape the pain, to make people laugh, to have fun. And it started, I could tell, leading down to a road where drinking was just more on my mind. And so when I came to faith, I quickly cut that out of my life, just altogether. And I remember one person in that friend group that I was part of, he said, Robert's not fun unless he drinks. So maybe I'm not very fun. But that hurt, and I didn't get invited to parties anymore. I didn't really hang out with many of those people anymore. And I just remember thinking, like, man, I'm trying here to do the right thing, and this just feels like it's not working at all. And so that's kind of our big idea today, is that sometimes in life we do the exact right thing, and yet it produces the wrong results. And so we're going to be talking about that this morning. And I have a sense that this probably resonates with most of you in here, and I can give a case study on why I think that this is an issue that we all face in 2 words, and the words are parenting toddlers. When the right thing you're doing doesn't produce the right result, if you've parented toddlers, these little things, creatures, whatever they even are, and you give yourself to them and you do everything that you think is right, and you set boundaries and limits, and you love them, and you push yourself to play with them and care for them, and you're still the worst parent ever. And it's so defeating, and it's hard. Like, you've probably been there. For some people in here, you are in a relationship where you feel like you're giving, and you're giving, and you're giving, and year after year you're praying for your spouse or the person you're in a relationship with, and it's not being reciprocated. You're doing all the right stuff. You're giving all this effort, but you feel like they are not putting in the same amount that you're putting in, and it's deflating. It's disheartening. For some people, maybe you are working in the marketplace and you see coworkers who are cutting corners or skimming off the top for themselves, and they're getting promotions and raises, and you're thinking, that's not right, that's not ethical, I'm not going to do that. But it's really frustrating because it kind of keeps you stuck. And then, of course, who in here hasn't tried to have a conflict conversation where you think, I'm going to take the initiative, I'm going to have that hard conversation, I don't want to, but I'm going to, and you do it, and then it just blows up in your face, and you're left thinking, why even try? Why do I do this? So that's our question is, how do we respond when we do the right thing, but it doesn't produce the right result or the result we were expecting? And we've been working our way through the book of Acts, and I think you're going to be surprised this morning to see the parallels between our lives and trying to do the right things and Paul's life when he was trying to do the right thing and it did not produce the right result. And we're going to use Paul as a case study on how we should approach these kinds of situations. So I'm going to pray for us, and we're just going to start digging right into Acts 21, starting in verse 15. So, Jesus, you are the master. We submit ourselves to your leadership, your wisdom. You are the Word made flesh. God, your words created the galaxies, the universe, everything in existence. By the power of your word, you created everything. Jesus, you were the Word made flesh, and you carried all power and authority, and you defeated death. And you guys have preserved our word, the scriptures. You've preserved it for us to read and to meditate on and to apply. And we need your help, Spirit of God. We need your help to illuminate the text and to live it. We want to be transformed and changed by what we're reading. This is not just information to have. This is transformation. So, Spirit, help us as we attempt this journey this morning. Amen. Acts 21:15. After these days, we got ready and we went up to Jerusalem. So you'll remember last week, Jeff talked about how Paul and some other Christians were talking about whether or not he should go to Jerusalem. And Paul prayed about it, and he really felt like the Spirit was leading him to go and make this journey down there. And so it says, some of the disciples from Caesarea went with us, bringing us to the house of Manasseh of Cyprus, an early disciple with whom we should lodge. When we had come to Jerusalem, the brothers received us gladly. On the following day, Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present. So think like walking into a meeting room, and your boss is there, and your boss's boss, and your boss's boss's boss. That's not quite exactly what's going on, but that's like the feel that I get as Paul walked into this room. Potential tension. It says, after greeting them, Paul related one by one the things that God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. So imagine. It's subtle in the text, but you've got the apostle of the Gentiles, Paul. He's been working with non-Jewish people, walking into Jerusalem to meet with James and the other leaders who are primarily working with the Jewish audience. And there's some potential conflict, but nothing explicit, and Paul starts to share what God is doing among the non-Jewish people. And then it says, when they heard it, they glorify God. And so it's like, okay, good. Tension alleviated, there's no conflict. Like, these people are unified in wanting to see God's work expand throughout the world, even though they are kind of working with different types of people with different needs and different struggles and all kinds of things. They're unified in, and they glorify God. And then they say to Paul, you see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who have believed. They are all zealous for the law. And they have been told about you that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or walk according to our customs. What then is to be done? They will certainly hear that you have come. Okay, so the issue is that it's circulating around that Paul is teaching the Jews to abandon their heritage, their Jewish law. And it says forsake. This was like language of defection. Like, people were thinking Paul was like this rebel coming in and trying to get people to defect from their cultural customs and heritage, things that were so important to them. And if you're unfamiliar with or newer to the Bible, here's kind of a crash course. God came to his people. He called them the Israelites, the Jewish people, and he gave them the law, which were really just instructions for how to live in a way that honors God and brings life. And these laws were never meant to oppress people or weigh them down. In fact, a lot of them were aimed towards the vulnerable and giving them a leg up and helping them follow God and be able to live in society. They were meant to give people a sense of freedom. Now, the problem was twofold. One, over time, people started adding commentary to these laws because there was a lot of gray areas and a lot of, well, okay, we're not supposed to do this, but what about this situation, that situation? And so they added all these commentaries to kind of flesh out what they thought the law should look like. And by the end of the day, there were more comments on the law than there were laws themselves, and it just felt very weight-bearing. Like, it was just very oppressive, almost like you couldn't do anything right. So that was one issue. And the other issue was people began to believe that by keeping these laws, that was their way of being accepted by God. They were trying to earn God's favor. So, of course, you fast forward to the time when Jesus comes to earth, and it's really interesting because Jesus said, I came to fulfill the law. He doesn't say, I came to abolish the law or abandon the law, but fulfill it. And Jesus was fascinating because he would take the law's standards, and sometimes he would heighten it and amplify it. He would say things like, you've heard it said that it's wrong to murder your brother and kill them, but I say even being angry at them is the same root problem. He would just heighten it, and it's because they thought, oh, it's all about my behaviors, and Jesus brought it to the heart issue. No, it's actually about what is inside you. And so, this was impacting three groups of people at the time. When Jesus came and said, I'm fulfilling the law, it was impacting these ethnic Jewish people who were born to be Jewish. It was affecting Jewish proselytes. These were Gentiles who became Jews, and they went through the ceremonies to become a Jewish person. And then, of course, you had the non-Jewish people, the Gentiles. And the idea was that people who were Jewish or Jewish proselytes, if they chose to follow Jesus, then they could still follow the Old Testament laws, assuming they weren't doing it in a legalistic way where they were trying to earn God's favor. It was being acknowledged like this is part of their culture, part of their heritage. It's okay for them to continue to follow these laws. But then the Gentile followers of Jesus, the idea was that there is no obligation whatsoever for them to follow the Old Testament laws. In other words, they do not have to become Jewish first and then start to follow Jesus. The Gentiles could have direct access to being a follower of Jesus. And so Paul, at this point, he's pretty well known, and James and the leaders are concerned about his reputation, especially now that he is down here in Jerusalem, this like hotspot hub of ministry. And I think the topic of how the Old Testament law relates to New Testament gospel, maybe if you've been around, you've kind of heard those phrases. It's pretty complex. This is like a 400-page tome, 5 views on law and gospel. And just to put it in perspective, like how hard it is to relate these two things, here's some of the chapter titles. The law is the perfection of righteousness in Jesus Christ, a reformed perspective. And then you've got the theonomic reformed approach to the law and gospel. You've got the inauguration of the law of Christ with the gospel of Christ, a dispensationalist view. And then my favorite one is the law of Christ as the fulfillment of the law of Moses, a modified Lutheran view, because I guess the regular Lutheran view just didn't make the cut for some reason. Like, my point is, like, this is a complicated topic, and instead of getting in the weeds and trying to figure out all the details, the point I want to make for us is that Paul was humble enough to listen to James and these leaders. He said, okay, I respect you guys. I want to hear you out. I want to hear what you have to say. And this is what happens. They said to Paul, do therefore what we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Take these men and purify yourself along with them and pay their expenses so that they may shave their heads. Thus all will know that there is nothing in what they have been told about you, but that you yourself also live in observance of the law. But as for the Gentiles who have believed, we have sent a letter with our judgment that they should abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols and from blood and from what has been strangled and from sexual immorality. If you're reading that and you're like, what the heck is he talking about? I encourage you to look at our sermon archive on our Facebook page. You can go and look up all the past messages and look for Acts 15. That is the chapter where we deal with that passage in particular. So it says, then Paul took the men, and the next day he purified himself along with them and went into the temple, giving notice when the days of purification would be fulfilled and the offering presented for each one of them. Okay, so Paul is directed to pay the expenses of the vow for these pilgrims that were coming to do this purification ritual. And he didn't participate in the vow, although he had just recently completed one, but he was going to participate in at least part of this 7-day purification ceremony that came at the end of the vow. And so the idea is maybe Paul's public identifying with this revered Jewish institution and doing this kind deed for these people, maybe that would go a long way in squelching the rumors that he was anti-Jewish law or anti-heritage. And this is a pretty challenging passage. A lot of people have read this and said, I don't know, man, would the real Paul have submitted to that request? Would the real Paul do that? Would that contradict his message of salvation by grace alone through faith? Is he saying that you sometimes have to do things to be accepted by God? And I think the answer is Paul would say, no, of course not. I don't have a problem with Jewish people being Jewish, though. And Paul's going to say it's fine to live in your native culture and practice your native customs, assuming they're not in direct opposition to the gospel. We're not talking like witchcraft or witch doctors and going and just denying Jesus or using mediums and trying to tap into the spirit realm. This was just a question of normal cultural heritage that was not necessarily in opposition to what God was trying to do. And I think the point for us is, sometimes what may not be necessary for us personally to do is necessary to maintain unity. It might not be necessary for you personally to engage in something or to refrain from something, but maybe it's necessary for the sake of unity. And, Paul, he talked a lot about being free in the Spirit. He said, I'm free. I'm a free man. And he knew there was some things that he could participate in and could do, but he refrained from doing those things because he didn't want to make anybody stumble. He didn't want to cause people to question who Jesus was. And it's this idea that Paul was so free that he was not in bondage to his own freedom. Right? He was not saying like, no, you guys don't get it. James, come on, man. I know more about this than you do. I don't have to do these things. I'm a free man. I don't know. He doesn't do that at all. For Paul, it was more important that the gospel was accurately represented than for his freedoms to be known. Like, that was so key for him. He wanted there to be a accurate gospel representation more than he wanted to maintain his own freedoms and liberties. And this is the beginning of Paul. He's doing the right thing right now, but as we're going to read, we're going to see the results are not going to go the way he might expect. So when the 7 days were almost completed, the Jews from Asia, seeing him in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd and laid hands on him, crying out, "Men of Israel, help! This is the man who is teaching everyone everywhere against the people and the law in this place. Moreover, he even brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place. For they had previously seen Trophimus, the Ephesian, with him in the city, and they supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple." Man, so much for all that he was doing. Like, he's almost at the end of this, purification ritual, and then all this happens, and it seems like it's a wash. And he's got two accusations hurled against him. One, they're saying that Paul is teaching against the people, the law, and this place. That's the temple. And this is interesting because this was a very similar accusation that was brought against Stephen in Acts chapter 6. Stephen ended up being martyred for his faith, but they said that Stephen was teaching against the temple. Like, you can see how rooted it was in their belief system that you don't talk badly about our heritage. And I think this is intentional by Luke. Like, he wants us to see this tie to Stephen because Stephen's martyrdom was patterned after Jesus. And so you get this feeling that so goes Jesus, so goes Stephen, so goes Paul. And then you think, what about us? What does that mean for us? And so that's the first accusation, is Paul's teaching against the customs. And the second is that Paul has brought Greeks into the temple and defiled it. This was a serious issue for them. The temple at this point was fairly large, and it was made up of different sections in which, based on your status or your race or your gender, you were allowed to go into these more inner courts as you proceeded into the temple. And as you got more and more inward, you would come across these 4.5-foot tall stone markers, and they were inscribed in the outer court before foreigners could go into the inner courts. And they said this here. We found some of these in archaeological digs. We found two, and this is the transcription that they've translated. "No foreigner may enter within the barricade which surrounds the temple and enclosure. Anyone who is caught doing so will have himself to blame for his ensuing death." Jeez, man, like, that's intense. The temple was the central symbol of Israel. It was like the flag for us, like the White House. Like, you don't burn the flag and get good favor. You don't make threats against the White House. For them and their culture to challenge their customs that had been passed down to them for thousands of years by their ancestors, that was akin to terrorism. I mean, that was like the definition of what it meant to be a terrorist. And this is how they respond to Paul. I'm going to summarize the next few verses if you're following along in your Bible. The people, they at this point, they grab Paul and they take him and they start beating him. And it's such an uproar that the guards come in, the tribune comes in, and they put a stop to Paul's beatings. They move Paul away, and they bind him with chains, they arrest him, and then they start to carry him up to a different area. And then it says when he came to the steps, he was actually carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the crowd. For the mob of the people followed, crying out, "Away with him." That's interesting. Remember how I talked about how this account seems to be a parallel to Stephen's execution? Well, that phrase, "away with him," that phrase was used at another point when Jesus had been arrested and he was standing ready to receive his sentence. And the people, the leaders were asking the people, "Do you want us to sentence Jesus? Or do you want us to sentence this prisoner, Barabbas, who is not a great guy?" And the people shouted, "Away with Jesus. Away with that man. Give us Barabbas." And so you get another hint. So goes Jesus. So goes Stephen. So goes Paul. So goes us. And I think it's the idea that Paul was being accused wrongly and accursed, just like Jesus had been. This introduces to us a journey of suffering and injustice that Paul is going to experience because of his commitment to the gospel. So we're going to see what happens. As Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, he said to the tribune, "May I say something to you?" And the tribune said, "You know Greek? Aren't you the Egyptian then who recently stirred up a revolt and led the 4,000 terrorists of the assassins out into the wilderness?" Like, come on, this is gold. Imagine you've gone out of your way at this point to strive for unity. You've practiced self-denial. You have sought what God wants, and you have been obedient. And then you're accused of being a terrorist. It's like, oh my gosh. Like this tribune thought that Paul was this Egyptian rebel who Josephus, one historian, he talks about this revolter. He gathered a group of 4,000 rebels, and he came up against Roman troops, and he was said to be a prophet. And he said, "When I get to Jerusalem, at my word, the walls will fall down." Well, that didn't happen at all. Instead, the Roman soldiers came out and they executed a lot of the Jewish revolters. They took 100 or so of them captive, and this Egyptian rebel fled into the wilderness, never to be seen from again. That was just 3 years before this encounter here. So now this guy thinks that, oh, here he is again. He's come back to cause havoc here. And Paul's like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. So he replies, "I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no obscure city. I beg you, permit me to speak to the people." And when he had given them permission, Paul, standing on the steps, motioned with his hand. There's a silence, and he addresses them in Hebrew. And he says, "Brothers and fathers, hear the defense that I now make before you." And it says when they heard he was addressing them in Hebrew, they became even more quiet. Why do you think he did that? He addresses them in their native tongue as a way to connect with them. Even though he's now been arrested and beaten, he is still trying to create peace. He's still going out of his way to connect with these people and let them know, I am not an enemy to your heritage. I am not your enemy. He just wants to share about Jesus. And so he starts to tell a story. He says how he was educated by a very respected rabbi of the time, a well-known rabbi, and he was so zealous for the law that he would persecute Christians who he at one point thought the same thing that they thought about him, that these followers of Jesus did not appreciate the law. So he would persecute them, and he shared how he has this vision from Jesus, and he's told, Paul, why are you persecuting me? And he's told to go to Damascus, and he says how he got to Damascus, and he meets a man named Ananias, and he's telling the story, and he makes sure the people knows that Ananias was a well-respected, devout Jew who lived according to the law. And so he meets Ananias, and Ananias says, Paul, God has appointed you to know his will, to see the righteous one, to hear his voice, and then to witness to all you've seen and heard. And Paul's like, yeah, at that point, I was baptized. I was committed to following Jesus. And then Paul says this, when I had returned to Jerusalem, remember, he's talking to the crowd right now. When I had returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance and saw him say to me, make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me, which is hilarious because now he's in Jerusalem sharing his testimony, and they're still not going to accept it. And I said, Lord, they themselves know that in one synagogue after another I imprisoned and beat those who believed in you. And when the blood of Stephen, your witness, was being shed, I myself was standing by and approving and watching over the garments of those who killed him. Imagine how hard that is to say. It had to be hard for Paul to say. And God said to me, go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. Now, it's at this point Paul has done everything he can, right? He has completed the purification ritual like James and the leaders asked. He has spoken about his education, his upbringing, his early history of being zealous for the law. He wanted people to get the point that he was made for this. Paul was built to be a Jewish follower of the law. He was like an Olympic athlete who from a young age had been training for a sport and learning it, and then they got older and they didn't. They just fell away from it. And so for these people, it would be shocking that Paul would do all of this training and then not follow through with being a good Jewish rabbi. And then he says, God not only called me away, but he sent me to the Gentiles, the non-Jewish people. And when they heard that, they lost it. They were livid that Paul would insinuate that after all that training, God would send him to non-Jewish people. And it's like, talk about not being able to catch a break. Man, Paul has done all the right things, but he's just coming up against the wrong results. I'm positive you've been there. I know you resonate with that feeling. It's just, it's maddening inside. And so I want us to pause and think about, how was Paul able to stay so calm? How was he able to handle this in a way that was thoughtful, that was compelling? How did he not get pulled into all the potential negative emotions that could have derailed him? And I'm thinking about not just this text, but all that we know about Paul. And I've been thinking through 4 things that I think helped him to be able to stay so calm. 1, Paul recognized the presence of God in this situation. So Paul, he wasn't surprised. He knew following Jesus can and does lead to situations like this where I'm being misrepresented. It didn't surprise him. He didn't blame God. He didn't say to God, come on, man, I was obedient to you. I listened to you. I've constantly been beaten and hurt for your sake, and now you're going to do this to me? After all that I've done for you? He didn't even go there. And he definitely didn't blame himself. He didn't say, geez, I should have listened to Agabus, the guy that told me not to go to Jerusalem. I'm an idiot. I'm a failure. What was I thinking? He didn't do that. He recognized God's presence in the situation. He accepted what God had for him. Second, he was attuned to the Spirit of God in him. All right, so he trusted that the Spirit had led him to Jerusalem, but he also knew that the Spirit gave him access to a power, a resurrection power that could help him to kind of disassociate from those negative emotions. I don't know if you've had times like this. I'll say I am a fairly emotional person in that, like, I just tend to be pretty aware of my emotions, but the downfall is I get sucked into my emotions really, really fast. So if I'm having a bad day, it's really hard for me to think, okay, no, God, like, I've got your Spirit. You know, your Spirit it's not a spirit of fear, it's a spirit of faith, and I can combat those negative emotions and this negative thinking. It's so hard for me to go there, but Paul had this belief that the Spirit gave us access to a new kind of way of living so that we didn't get pulled into those emotions. So he was attuned to the Spirit of God in him. Third, Paul assessed how to move forward in a way that honored God. He didn't ask the why. He didn't say, why is this happening to me? Why does this always happen to me? And it happened to Paul a lot. He was shipwrecked. He was beaten. He was put in prison multiple times. He was misrepresented, misunderstood. He didn't go there. He didn't say why. Instead, he said, God, what next? It's like he received the wrong results with open arms and he adapted. He said, what next, God? I will do anything for you. He didn't try to get even. He didn't try to hurt anyone else. No, he moved forward in a way that honored God. And lastly, he made space for the gospel to redeem the situation. Think about it. Okay, so Paul is accused of going into the temple with the Gentile and defiling the sanctity of the temple. All right, that was one of the accusations. It is this same Paul who, in a different letter to a different church, wrote, but now in Christ Jesus, you who were once far off, he's talking about the Gentiles, have now been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who has made us both one and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility. And you gotta wonder if Paul was imagining that wall in the temple as he was writing that. Imagine walking through the temple and you see this inscription, you see this wall, and just because of your race or your gender or your status, you're not allowed in. And you're shaking your head like, geez, this isn't it. Because you know in your heart Jesus has broken down that dividing wall. You know that God has made a way for all people, regardless of their race, their gender, their status, to have equal access to him. He's broken down the wall of segregation, and that is the gospel. That's the good news, that God has made a way for the dividing wall between humans and him to be crumbled. And now we're invited into a new world order. We're invited into a new family. We're invited into a new kingdom in which we can follow Jesus. But it's not easy. It's not easy to be part of this new family. Paul's commitment to the gospel, which it was evidenced by his act of self-denial for the sake of unity, led to not the results he was expecting. It led to injustice. He was misrepresented by others, and he was misunderstood. But Paul didn't try to take charge in his own power and fix it. And what's more, if you read on, I didn't put the text up here, but if you read on, it gets so bad that finally Paul is taken away and they're going to flog him, which was a brutal way to torture someone, and it often resulted in death or being impaired in some way. Like a lot of people, their lives were changed forever because of the flogging. And it's at this point, Paul says, hold up, I'm a Roman citizen. You can't flog me without a trial. And so they back off and they're like, what? But as I was reading it, I just kept thinking, why didn't he say that ages ago? You know, like, I mean, the dude's been beaten, he's been misrepresented, and he didn't pull that status card. He waited. And the only thing I can think, and I'm not positive about this, but it's just my hunch, is what if Paul just desperately wanted the opportunity to speak about his testimony? And he saw that this was a chance without pulling that trump card. What if Paul was so committed to the message of Jesus that he endured the beatings, he endured the misrepresentation, because it gave him a platform to be able to speak about the grace of God in his life? And now when, this is coming to the end here, yeah, he's going to pull out that card that he's a Roman citizen because he doesn't want to be flogged. And I just wonder, like, what does that do for us? What does that do for you? What does it do for me? What does our commitment to the gospel do for us today? And I think, going back to earlier with the examples we gave, maybe for you, definitely for me, maybe it means parenting with patience and kindness, consistently showing my children the character that I want them to develop, even if I'm called mean daddy, which is one of their newest things. Mean mommy, mean daddy. You feel it, I'm sure. But it means I just parent with patience because I'm committed to the gospel. Maybe for you, it means staying in your relationship, staying committed to your spouse. You continue to pray for them. You continue to serve them, continue to love them, even if it's not always being reciprocated yet. Maybe for you, it means maintaining your integrity at your job, even if you don't get the promotion, or even if you lose your job. You maintain your integrity because of your commitment to the gospel. Maybe it means taking initiative to have that hard conversation. I remember being in high school, I ran from conflict, and that was well into my adulthood. I just ran and ran and ran. I did not want to have the hard conversations. But maybe a commitment to the gospel means you take the initiative, even if it might blow up in your face. I think for many of us, what this looks like is staying faithful to God in extended periods of suffering and trials. It's hard, but whatever it is for you, your commitment to the gospel means that you do not fear to continue to do the right thing, even if you suspect it's going to lead to unjust results. I think about my life. It's so hard for me. One of my personal barriers to this is I'm a runner. I've shared that before. I'm a runner. So I am so much a runner that I think about God's promises, and I get so nervous that he's not going to keep his promise and be there for me, that I kind of put it in my head, well, if he fails, then this is all a joke. Like, Christianity is just a total joke. And I'm so, like, afraid of it being a joke that I'm going to fail first. That way he can't fail. Like, imagine my poor wife, like, how often, like, I'm just going to fail first. That way I can't risk anyone else letting me down. I'll just let you down and let myself down. It's an awful way to approach life. I don't recommend it. But that is one of my personal barriers that I come up against is that fear is so rooted in me that I just say, I'll just back out and run. That way I don't risk being let down myself. When I'm honest with myself and compare myself to Paul, it can be discouraging. Paul, he recognized God's presence in the situation. And he wasn't surprised, but I am surprised often when I go through hard times. I tend to blame God and say, I can't believe you would do this after all that I've done for you, which most of the time is not much. I don't know why my mind goes here. Or I blame myself, and I just think I'm an idiot, I'm a failure. Why do I even try to keep doing this? So much I get pulled into those emotions, and I get stuck in the why, and it makes me bitter, and I just say, why is this happening to me? And I'll tell you guys, it has often in my life led to restricting the space the gospel needs to work. Sometimes I love my comfort so much that I diminish the space that God needs for the gospel to redeem the situation. But I know I'm growing. I know I'm growing. I am so much farther along than I was 10 years ago and even 6 months ago. So much farther along, growing in this. The gospel is not convenient. Not convenient. But Jesus will meet you in that inconvenience, and he will minister to you and transform you. I'm going to invite the band to come up. Our application is general because this can be applied in so many different ways, but it's commit to acting in a way that honors God and maintains your own personal integrity. That's it. It's hard to do, but imagine what our faith community would look like if we did this. Imagine what it would look like if we accepted that the gospel's not convenient. What if in our relationships we submitted to one another out of love and respect? We practiced self-denial for the sake of unity. And what would it look like if we didn't retaliate when it blew up in our face? What if we boldly stood up against injustice and worked hard to maintain our personal integrity, even if we're misunderstood and misrepresented all the time? I think of all the stories I hear of Muslims coming to faith through dreams and visions, and Jesus meets them where they are, but it's terrifying because when they accept Jesus, they're cut off from their family. They're threatened to be killed. They're cut off from resources that they need to survive, but to them, it's worth it because it's such a high calling to follow him, but it's worth it. And this is where community comes in. Like, we need each other to do this. I need you to do this. This is why we have life groups, why we're launching this discipleship group initiative, is because we want people to get together and talk about Jesus and learn to trust and follow Jesus and commit to him more. And we need each other. We have things like this because we know the joy that is brought when you practice self-sacrificial love of God and others. And so now we're going to take a few moments and we're just going to worship him.